This is Poured Over, the Barnes & Noble podcast. My name is Chris Gillespie. My guest today is the articles editor of The New Yorker, as well as the former editor-in-chief of the New York Observer and an original editor of Spy Magazine. She's also the author of a terrific new biography of legend and icon Lorne Michaels, entitled Lorne, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live. Please join me in welcoming to the show Susan Morrison. Susan, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
As a huge comedy nerd and a longtime fan of Saturday Night Live, I've really enjoyed the book so far. This is the first ever official, authorized biography of Lorne Michaels. Is that correct?
Well, it's the first biography of Lorne. It's authorized as a kind of a funny technical term. I wouldn't say it is technically authorized. I mean, he participated in it. I interviewed him about 50 times. He gave me a lot of access. But I hesitate to use the word authorized because I think that often makes people think that it was something that the subject initiated, that is sort of a vanity project, which isn't the case with Lorne. Lorne, I think, would have preferred to stay behind the curtain forever. In a way, I feel like I inflicted this book on him. And when I went to his office in the beginning to tell him that I had signed a contract to write a book about him and the show, I told him I didn't need anything from him, but that if he would talk to me, it would be a richer and better book. And he looked like he was about to, pass out. It isn't a natural mode for him to be sitting down talking about himself, but he knew me a little bit, and he respected me, and he loves the New Yorker, and he came around. And as I said, we spent, years of very nice Friday evenings in his office, just talking over everything. And I think we both enjoyed it.
That's great. He's obviously someone that's been in the public eye for 50 years at this point, even longer, I guess, like you're going, you talk about in the book, but he is famously private and kind of closed off. He's a little bit of a mystery. Where did the kernel of the idea come to you where you're like, I'm going to write a biography of Lorne Michaels? How did that first come about in your mind?
Well, about 10 years ago, I was watching the 40th anniversary SNL special, and I thought it was terrific. I was laughing a lot, but I was also really moved. I realized how uncanny it was that one guy, this Canadian Lorne Michaels, was responsible for what so many generations of Americans laugh at, what we find funny. The longevity, no one has had that kind of career in show business. And I was just fascinated by the fact that he was so central to all of comedy and a lot of modern American show business, but has kept himself out of the public eye. He really has been kind of hiding in plain sight. And, I knew him a little bit. I worked for him very briefly in the 90s on a failed show he did called The New Show. And so I would maybe bump into him every 10 years, and it was always friendly. But I thought, this is a great book. And I knew many of his writers. I'd been hearing people who work for Lorne kind of complain about him and obsess about him for decades because he calls all the shots. He's this mercurial sort of remote boss, and they all owe so much to him and they revere him so much, but they're also like a little bit afraid of him. And I knew that there was something very potent there that if I could get at would be interesting. And the gamble was, would it be interesting to the wider world outside of kind of 500, comedy cognoscenti? And when I started interviewing cast members, it was amazing to see all the different figures they compared him to, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Jay Gatsby, Robert Moses, Darth Vader. Some even compared him to Donald Trump in terms of his, ratings-obsessed fickleness. But, as I said, all of this is mixed with this. It's an enormous kind of reverence and a little bit of fear. Anyway, it was something really interesting to try to chip away at.
Yeah, I think he did a fantastic job, and I think even the cover of the book is it's beautiful, and I think that's actually from that SNL 40 special. I think right, that's
It
from
is, yeah.
where he's surrounded by all of the SNL alumni and cast members wearing tuxedos, and it's just a who's who of celebrities and entertainers. And I think he reading the book, I'm hard pressed to think of anyone else who has had as much influence on certainly American comedy as Lorne Michaels. I mean, is there anyone else that comes to mind? Like maybe a Johnny Carson, but even that, I think Lorne Michaels has.
Yeah, Carson is an interesting comparison because he had, incredible, he was on for decades. He had this
Mhm.
longevity, but he wasn't an impresario like Lorne. Lorne really finds the talent, develops it, grows it, and launches it. I think the best comparison for Lorne is almost the old studio system. He's kind of created this culture with walls around it. And there's generations of it's. Sometimes I say he's like a guy who's had children with five different wives, or all these different generations of his people,
Mm.
and they all play well together, and they're all part of the tribe. They act in each other's productions. If you think about all of the people who guest starred on, say, 30 Rock, all these people from the SNL diaspora, all sort of, meet each other there. But in terms of just cultural reach, like outside of comedy, the only other person that I think comes close to him is sort of Quincy Jones in terms of what Quincy Jones did in the music business, decades of different kinds of music, incredibly powerful at finding the people who are going to be, the next big thing. But, you were just talking about the cover of the book. One of the reasons that I chose that photograph, it's not just that there's a whole bunch of famous people, but the generations it spans. You have Taylor Swift, and you have Bill Murray, and you have Tim Meadows, and, it just spans so many generations. And as I've been touring and talking about the book in front of groups of people, it's been so fun to hear about how many people watch the show with their kids or their parents or even their grandparents, and they all have their own SNL connection. Amy Poehler, I quote Amy Poehler in the book saying, this is apropos the advances in technology. She said, SNL is the show that my parents used to have sex to, that now I watch on my computer in the middle of the day on Monday. but but it does, the reach across all those 50 years is phenomenal.
And I think something else that is communicated by the cover is, not only are you have all these people on it, but Lorne is in the center, and everyone else has big grins, and he's just kind of, smiling in his own way, but clearly is very uncomfortable being in the center of
Yeah.
attention just based off of his body language and everything.
Yeah, I call that resting Lorne face. It's like
Okay.
I have to be in this photograph, but
So he's not. Would you say he's mildly happy here, or that's just kind of like he's truly unhappy not being in the
oh,
center of attention like that?
I think if you look at that shot, he's not at all unhappy, but I think
Yeah.
he's very relieved. One of the things that I think the book conveys and that I got to experience, reporting this book, logging so many hours at the show while it was going on, is viewers at home, I think sometimes miss this, is the almost athletic quality of producing a live television show.
Mm.
The closest thing to it on television is live sports because you just anything can happen. Huge measures are taken, so that nothing unpredictable does happen. But it's getting it to time. It's making the sketches end right on the right second so that the commercial break can go in, and so you can fit everything in. And so I think what you really see on his face in that picture is relief. Every Saturday at 1 o'clock in the morning, he's just so relieved that another one got done. And of course, he says that all he does Sunday is think about Saturday's mistakes. But then Monday is a day of redemption. It gets to start all over again.
After all of these years, like, why do you think that he still puts himself through that? Because I imagine other people or most people maybe would be like, I can't do this. I can't do this once, let alone week after week for 50 years. What do you think he's still getting out of it at this point that keeps him going through such a brutal cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, It's interesting to know that in 50 years, except for the few years when he was not producing the show, he has never missed a Saturday night. He's never been home with a stomach flu. He's always there, which is incredible. I think that, he told me that if he ever once felt that the show had gone completely perfect, that everything worked, he wouldn't want to do it again. I think there's always this sense of, he says on his tombstone will be the word uneven, and that's kind of SNL as a grab bag. I think anyone who watches it, if I watch it, there are maybe three things in it that I will like and think is, and I won't like a bunch of the other things. And that's sort of the nature of a variety program. And that's, why it's such a hardy format. But I think that there's always a feeling that next week can maybe be a little bit better. Another thing is, and this is baked into the format, in the very beginning, the president of NBC in 1975, a guy named Herb Schlosser, who he was the president, and he never got enough credit for creating SNL. Not that Lorne didn't give him credit, but, he's a behind the scenes guy that people aren't as interested in. He dictated a lot of the original contours of the show. He wanted something on at 11:30 to replace these Johnny Carson reruns. He wanted it to be live. He wanted it to be broadcast from 30 Rock in New York, because that building was sort of, deer were running through the halls at that point, as Lorne likes to say. And he wanted it to have rotating hosts. Now, a lot of people don't realize that wasn't Lorne's idea. And in fact, he was at first a little unsure of that. And then he realized, oh, that will keep the show really fresh. If there's a new host every week, the writers won't have to be thinking week after week, okay, what's Sonny going to say to Cher this week? You're writing for the same people, a kind of staleness sets in. But if you have a new host, there's a kind of a frisson of excitement every single week. It's a new chemistry. You're starting fresh out of the box. And I think that's part of it. I mean, he also loves young people. He loves continuing to discover fresh, new talent and seeing what they're capable of. This season, since the book has come out, he and I text a lot, and he's very excited about a newcomer, this young woman named Jane Wickline. It's her first season, and he just loves that she's thriving on the show. I think that's still hugely gratifying for him.
Something else too that kind of ties into some of the things that we've talked about so far about, comparisons to Lorne Michaels as a figure throughout history. I think, honestly, reading the book, the thing that I keep thinking about, and the book that it reminds me of, is Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, because I think there's also a level of comparison between Lorne and Steve Jobs in terms of these kinds of, these guys that come from very humble beginnings and have these big ideas and these huge ideas that end up kind of forever changing the culture. Obviously, Steve Jobs was in the realm of technology and business. I think Lorne's in show business and arts and entertainment and comedy, obviously. But also this idea that they are gifted with, because, thinking about the Herb Schlesinger and how he had some of the ideas, the puzzle pieces that would kind of ultimately lead into what would become SNL. I think Lorne's gift, or at least what I'm gleaning from the book, is that he does have that kind of producer mindset. Like, that's almost his real gift, is being able to see those puzzle pieces and know how to assemble them in a certain way, rather than, obviously he's very funny and can hold his own as a comedy writer and a director, but it seems like his real skill set is putting those pieces together, seeing how things might fit, understanding what's relevant or what's going to be interesting to a larger audience over the span of 50 years, which is like such an incredible gift. One of the things that I will move off of the cover in a second.
Wait, let me just jump in there if you don't mind. I think that's such a good way of describing his skill, which is kind of amorphous. And it reminds me, at some point in the book, I say that he keeps a mental list of historical figures who he in some ways identifies with. And it's not a modest list. One of them is Shakespeare, okay? But another one of them is Thomas Edison, because Edison said he didn't feel that he invented things, but he perfected ideas that were already in the air. And I think that's something that Lorne, he feels like, yeah, SNL had many fathers, had many begetters, but he was the one who kind of figured out, okay, you take this old-fashioned format, variety television, which is as old as vaudeville, and in the 70s when he had these jobs on cruddy shows in Los Angeles, like working for Phyllis Diller and Perry Como, they had that format, but the content was so old-fashioned. It was, stuck in the 50s. And his idea was to take that format and update it, for the sex and drugs and rock and roll generation. And so, he sort of plucked things that were already there and put them together, and is still very attuned to what's coming next. He's been very smart and lucky, I think, in terms of technology. If you think about the early seasons of the show, they had short films by people like Albert Brooks and Tom Schiller and Gary Weiss. And, over time, that gave way to the digital shorts that Andy Samberg and Lonely Island did. And all those things, they work especially great in the YouTube, era, because they're all modular, as are sketches. The show is perfectly clippable. You can watch a sketch on the subway on your way to work in the morning. It doesn't really work that way with Friends, right? Or Succession. You can't consume it that way.
And there is a big part of the first half of the book, or Lorne's upbringing, the early start of his career is, and I think it's something that I, being, in my early 30s, I didn't necessarily have visibility to this in my lifetime of really, like you're saying, the paradigm shift that was happening in culture and entertainment before SNL came about, and how there was this generational shift that needed to happen, or felt like it was going to happen, or was happening, both in terms of the culture, but also politics and everything like that. And I think Lorne very aptly saw that moment and that opportunity about to happen, and was able to express that on television. I was curious about why in the subtitle of the book you have the man who invented Saturday Night Live versus created Saturday Night Live, because invented seems like it kind of goes back to what I was saying about like the Steve Jobs thing, where why inventing?
It's interesting. In the beginning, I was thinking of just calling it the man who invented Saturday night. Because this idea that he created Saturday night is sort of this cultural thing that is now defined by Saturday Night Live. And then I realized I wanted the whole title of the show. But I think it is for the same reasons that you just compared him to Steve Jobs. I think invented, it was radical. What he was doing was radical in its time, and it really was an invention. He told me that one of the things that made him bond with Lily Tomlin, who was a pioneer in television in the early 70s, one of the only people who was trying to put stuff on television, like in the same way that Lorne wanted to put, cool, countercultural stuff on television. And they worked together on some specials for Lily, and they bonded over the fact that if you watched a Bob Hope comedy special in like 1970, there would be characters who were supposed to be stoned in these sketches, but the actors playing them, they didn't know what that was, so they just acted drunk. So there was a sense that there wasn't anything on television for people who were 20 years old. Carol Burnett had a hugely popular variety show. I was obsessed with it as a little girl, but it was a completely different generation. Their sketches were about PTA meetings and, the garage door getting stuck and the family dog. And Lorne wanted to put on TV what his generation was thinking about, which is, how not to have a bad acid trip, or jokes about the pill and abortion and anorexia and just all the things that had been taboo on television until then. And in that way, it really was an invention to turn the stuff of young people's lives into TV entertainment.
It's interesting to me, too, because I think prior to reading the book, when I would think about Lorne Michaels, I would think about how he kind of had this aha moment, singular vision for Saturday Night Live, similar to like Isaac Newton having the apple drop on him, where he just had this spark of inspiration and it was fully formed immediately, and it was his first idea and everything went great. But I was surprised to learn that he actually had a lot of kind of missteps or kind of learning moments as a producer on his way to what would eventually become Saturday Night Live, excuse me. I was curious to hear if if you'd be able to tell the listener a little bit about some of those. I don't want to
Yeah.
say failures because they still brought him to where he is now, but those kind of learning moments that he had early in his career.
Yes. I felt so lucky as a biographer that this guy, who was born in Toronto in 1944, his early life, he was like a character out of Dickens in that almost everything that happened to him had some meaningful effect on what he did later. He learned these little lessons every step of the way. And partly that was because he was a very observant, smart kid. He was a quick study. There's a line in Portrait of a Lady where Henry James describes a character as one on whom nothing is wasted. And Lorne definitely is that kind of a character. He had these terrible showbiz jobs. He almost threw in the towel and went to law school like 3 or 4 different times when he just thought, "Oh my God, this is a dying business. I have to get out of this." But in every kind of dead end job he took, he learned something. Like, here's an example. His first Hollywood job was working for a show called The Beautiful Phyllis Diller Show. And for younger viewers or listeners, Phyllis Diller was this brilliant female comedian. There weren't too many of them back then. And her whole shtick was that she was kind of ugly and she wore a fright wig and she was always bitching about her lazy husband. And she was very, abrasive. And American audiences, the producers realized that the audiences watching that show in the 60s were uncomfortable having a woman be the host, be the MC. I mean, it was, before Gloria Steinem. I mean, that just made them uncomfortable. So they had to come up with a way of warming Phyllis Diller up for the viewers. So they thought, okay, why don't we, to humanize her, why don't we show her just having a sort of a chit chat kind of interview with some of her guests, her celebrity guests. So Lorne's job was to sit down and pre-interview these guests. And they were people like Vidal Sassoon, the hairdresser, Rudy Gernreich, who invented the topless bathing suit. And then he'd give these questions to Phyllis. She would have a little sit-down chat with them in front of the studio audience. And she would seem more like a regular lady. She would be humanized. And you could draw a direct line between that and the reason there's a monologue on SNL every week, because these guest hosts, celebrity guest hosts, come on the show. A lot of them have never done comedy. They've never done this kind of thing. And they come out and meet the audience. And the idea is to put the audience at ease, to make them recognize, Kevin Costner or Aubrey Plaza is just a regular person who can be, relatable. So, that's a lesson that he took from that one. And I mean, think about that. That's, 40 years earlier. And his second job, or maybe his third job in LA, was working for Laugh-In, which was a big hit. It was a kind of a zany variety show that had a lot of psychedelic graphics and a lot of quick one-liners. And it was a hit, but the writing staff, and Lorne was one of the writers, they worked in a motel miles from the studio. So he and his fellow writers would sit in this motel and just churn out gags that just all went into the maw. They turned them in. They were taken away who knows where. They were rewritten many times over by people that Lorne didn't even know. And he said that he and his fellow writers would sit in the motel and they'd watch the show when it aired on Monday. And sometimes you'd see glimmers of your ideas on the air, but there was no feeling of ownership, of authorship, of really being part of the process. And I think he found that really demoralizing. He said it was sort of like shoveling coal below decks on an ocean liner when a wild party was going on the deck. So again, you can draw a direct line from that lonely experience where he felt completely unappreciated to the model he created at Saturday Night Live, which is a model where the writers of SNL are enormously important. They're almost as central or more central than the cast. Lorne, in the first season, he hired the writers before the cast. He really wants their voices to be heard. Nobody messes with their writing. He told me, I became a producer to protect my writing, which was always being screwed over by other producers. So at SNL, and people don't know this, I think, like a writer writes a sketch, and assuming it gets picked to go into the show, the writer then completely produces that sketch. He or she will work with the costume designers to choose the costumes. They'll dictate what they want the set to look like, the music. They direct it. They make the final cuts. And that's why, I mean, Lorne's idea is that this makes them so invested in the work, that they give it their all. They take pride in it. And it's very unusual in television for the writer to be elevated this way. And it's why, more writers and cast members at SNL go on to become directors and showrunners than, any other writer's room in Hollywood, because these people learn all these different skills. And again, that was something I vaguely knew, but it was being there in the room, watching this all happen, that made me fully aware of the radical nature of that decision. The SNL writer is God.
To that point about being in the room and shadowing Lorne and shadowing the show, what was that like going in the first time? Because in the book, you have this really cool framing device where you take the reader through a week of production for the show, and that's woven into Lorne's life story. So you have these different kinds of, I don't want to say like landmarks, but these kinds of chapters that are Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that take you to a show that was being produced in 2018, I think it is, with Jonah Hill as the host. I was reading that, I was like, I would have been terrified to be sitting there being like, I know that I'm the biographer for Lorne, but I'm about to be exposed to all of these great comedic minds who are going to know what I'm there for and like what I'm doing. Like, were you nervous, and did they like pick up
Yeah,
on who you were and what you were doing?
it's a good observation. Well, first, let me explain why I decided to do it that way. As I was researching and talking to Lorne, and I was aware that there is a danger in any biography. And Lorne's 80 years old, so this is going to cover 80 years. I was aware that you want to avoid the reader feeling like you're taking them on this kind of death march through the years, just a slog year by year. And especially with a show like SNL, which is broken down into seasons, I didn't want it to start to feel like, okay, season 23 gives way to season 24 and then season 25. So I wanted the writing, the texture of the writing to be broken up. I also realized that, starting the book in dreary post-war Toronto in 1944 wasn't really the sexiest opening, And I wanted to set it up so that my readers, who aren't all, people inside the comedy world, would immediately get a sense of the magnetic, peculiar, mysterious personality of Lorne Michaels and the strange hold he has on all of his employees. So I realized I want to bring the readers right in the room with Lorne, show him working his strange jujitsu on all the people around him. So after I'd been interviewing Lorne for a couple of years, I said, what would make the book better is if I can just embed at the show for a week. If I can just come, just hang out near you. I won't talk. I won't make a nuisance of myself, but just sit there with my notepad and watch it all happen. And I'll tell you, I was a little bit surprised that he agreed, because he's never allowed anyone to sit in on so many of these very confidential meetings where the big decisions are being made. People are being cut. People are being criticized. It's not that it's backstabbing, but it's very frank. That really helped me understand how it all worked and his particular genius as a producer. But also, as you point out, it's just entertaining to read, to be that fly on the wall. And it was a little bit nerve-wracking. And the very first day, the first time I knew some of those people and they had seen me around and knew what I was up to. But I remember going in, it was for the Monday pitch meeting, the first meeting of the week. and I was in the office first. So I was sitting on the couch. It seemed like a normal place for, and I'm like a middle-aged lady.
Mm. Yeah.
And then everyone streams in, and I just noticed a couple of people who were probably a third of my age, just, they weren't rude, but just glaring at me like, what? What? And I was sitting in someone else's seat. I didn't know at that point that they had, these sort of assigned seats. And it just made me aware of both the hierarchy and there's so much ritual, so much about the way things are done at the show is done in this very ritualized way. People sit in the same place, people eat the same thing. And there's a lot of superstition. So I was like, okay. So I got up. I think I sat on the arm of someone else's chair. But, everyone was very welcoming. They knew that if it was okay with Lorne for me to be there, it was okay to be there. But yeah, I was aware that I was infiltrating this inner sanctum. I felt like I had gotten into the bat cave,
I would imagine it. I can't imagine. Like, it just sounds like such a incredible experience to just, because I think there's so many. I mean, there's definitely, magazine articles have been written about the process, and books have been. I know they did that, like a big oral history of SNL probably
Right.
10 or 15 years ago. They have a bunch of documentaries that are out with that shows that process. But being in it, I imagine, would be maybe like an out of body experience or kind of otherworldly to be just in the nexus of all that.
Yes, and the most valuable part of it was to see how, each day of the week has its own set of tasks, its own, its own tension. And of course, there's this momentum that develops toward the week. You start out Monday with all these wild pitches. Wednesday, there's a read through of like 40 sketches. And then it starts to be like the Hunger Games. Then it's sort of like who's going to be left standing, which sketches are going to be cut, which ones are going to be left in. Seth Meyers told me the worst thing that can happen to you on Saturday is to suddenly realize you don't even need hair and makeup, like you're cut from the show altogether. That doesn't happen too much because Lorne is actually humane and cares about everyone getting a moment of airtime, but it can happen. And so to feel the tension build, and by Saturday night, it's really knife point because they go into dress rehearsal with at least a half an hour more material than is going to be able to air. So, and I was sitting in this little place under the audience, under the bleachers with Lorne and his deputies, where he watches the dress rehearsal on a monitor. And some friends have told me that when they read the Saturday chapter of the book, like their heart is racing because it's so tense. And you see him, he's listening and he's it's really take no prisoners. A lot of his comments have to do with the lighting or cut or not liking somebody's costume or wig. He'll say that wig is starring in the sketch. You got to get rid of that wig. But there's a lot of kind of withering, very frank comments about the writing too. I mean, I saw him turn to one writer at one point and say, "Can you take this and make it longer?" And then Maggie Rogers, whose first record had just come out, was the musical guest that night. And she came out to do her first song in dress rehearsal. And she was wearing a kind of a weird looking red muumuu, and she was barefoot. And he was apoplectic. He called for the costume designer and he goes, "Where's she from? A place with roads?" He couldn't believe that she was going to be barefoot on national TV. And anyway, just to see this completely spontaneous, his reactions and how he cobbled it all together and made all the changes at the last minute was breathtaking. And I think, people tell me it's fun to read. So
That was something, like, having read about or watched about that process, and with the plethora of podcasts that are out there where you can hear SNL alumni, talking about the process and their experience with it. I was definitely familiar with the idea that it is this kind of pressure cooker environment. And I was wondering, reading the book, I was like, well, is Lorne in that pressure cooker himself, or is he kind of the chef who's operating the pressure cooker to get the dish like exactly how he wants it? And it sounds like, based off of that, he's very much kind of both. He's in the pressure cooker, but also kind of pulling the strings on the pressure cooker, to mix metaphors, I guess.
yeah, no, I one of the things that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't been there every day, and I could really see this, is that, he does think about it as and as an egalitarian show. There are a lot of employees, and
Mm.
all through the week, all the days through the week before Saturday, he wants to hear what everybody thinks. I mean, I've seen him even tick off names on a piece of paper at a meeting to make sure that everyone has spoken. He wants everyone's opinion. He'll ask 24-year-old PA what they think. He'll ask the costume assistants what they think of this, what they think of that. So he's metabolizing all of that. But then, and he cares about it. He really does want everyone's take. But what's different about Saturday is that after the dress rehearsal is over, he will go up there's a little internal staircase. It's just a little cruddy cinder block staircase that connects the 8th floor studio with the 9th floor where his office is. And he'll go up there, and I compare that. I mean, I didn't think about this till after the book was published, but my daughter works on the TV show Severance. And I feel like when he goes up that staircase, it's almost like the Severance elevator. And if something goes on in his head, it's like, and he comes out the other end. And at that point, it's just all in his head. He knows what he wants to do. He doesn't listen to anybody else. It's like, we're going to do this. We're going to cut this. We're going to change that. And he turns into a different person. It's like in a comedy emergency room. He's a general in battle, and he just kind of barks out his orders. There's a famous story that I quote in the book about at one of these post-dress rehearsal meetings, Bob Odenkirk, who was a writer on the show in the 90s, like goofing around, and Lorne turning to him and yelling, "Odenkirk, if you speak again, I'm going to break your legs." It's very serious at that moment. And he does become the guy. All bets are off. And just seeing that change. I mean, Paul McCartney, who's one of Lorne's close friends and who kindly talked to me for the book, told me that he loves to go to that Saturday night meeting just to see his friend in this mode. So yeah, I'd never seen anything like it. It was cool.
How important is that level of chaos and stress to the fabric of the show? Because I think about that a lot, and I was thinking about it when I was reading the book, where I think maybe other producers or writers, and I think it's funny that you mentioned Bob Odenkirk, because I do think about him. I feel like he was quoted in a documentary when they were doing SNL 50 stuff earlier this year, where he was saying the way that the show is produced and run like sucks out all of the joy that could possibly be in it. Like, I think Bob Odenkirk has been pretty outspoken about how it was not a good fit for him. But is it kind of like, what's the cause and what's the effect? Like, is the result, the end product, because of all that chaos, or is the chaos caused by what goes into just making the show happen, if that makes sense?
Well, over the years, there have been lots of critiques of the way it's done. In the beginning, they stayed up all night writing. Lorne likes to say the office was probably nicer than everybody's apartments back then, because they were all so poor. So they stayed up all night. There was a lot of cocaine. They were flying, they were doing this stuff. And yet all these years later, now when there isn't cocaine, and, Lorne likes to say Ozempic is the cast's drug of choice, they still stay up all night Tuesday writing. There's no earthly reason for them to do it that way. But Lorne likes to hang on to the old ways. He doesn't like anything to change. A lot of writers along the way over the years have said, well, wait a minute, why don't we just write more during the off weeks? Why don't we come in at 8 a.m. and write? Why don't we still do it this way? And Lorne will say, his explanation for it is he'll say, well, I think fatigue is your friend in comedy. That if you're exhausted, it breaks down barriers, you're more open to things. You're punchy, you're going to be better at kind of brainstorming. I mean, some people think that's hogwash, but that is his explanation for it. So there are all these kind of outmoded things that they cling to, even like using cue cards instead of teleprompters. I think that he believes, it might be intuitive, but he really does believe that level of chaos and anxiety does fuel the kind of creative juices of the show. It would be possible for them just to pick 90 minutes worth of material on Wednesday and just work on that and, put that on the air on Saturday. But then you wouldn't have any of that. Is my piece going to be cut? Am I going to be on the cutting room floor? Will I not get to go on tonight? I think he feels that all of that competition, chaos, anxiety keeps everybody on their toes and gives the show the adrenaline that makes it special. We'll never know because he's always done it that way.
And it is, I feel like it contributes to, I guess, for lack of a better word, like the magic of the show, certainly the mythology of the show, of that it has this whole, every week it almost feels like it's not going to happen. So the fact that it does happen every week, it almost feels like a minor miracle. I guess certainly that's the impression that I get, that the folks who are creating it feel like, oh my
Yeah.
God, I can't believe we did it again.
Well, it's if you ever get a chance to be in the audience and to watch the show as it happens, I have two daughters who are both theater kids, and they have come to the show with me. They are amazed. It's watching it. It is like watching live theater. In the studio, women are running in and out with scenery flats and chairs and couches, and people are changing costume in the corner. And there you definitely feel like you're backstage in a theater. And you get a little bit of that at home when the camera pulls back sometimes, and you see the cameras on cranes and but yeah, the excitement, the palpable excitement of all of this stuff happening around you live definitely makes the show more exciting. And I'm sure that the hope is that seeps through the TV screen to the people at home.
It's worked for 50 years. So I suppose that there's, the method of for the madness, or method of the madness, is well documented. I was also curious, like thinking about things that I have just always taken for granted about the show that I just never really thought about. But I'm like, this was never set in stone, was the fact that it takes place in New York City, which, reading the book and learning about Lorne's life, it kind of crossed my mind, like, why didn't he go with Los Angeles? He spent a lot of time in his 20s in LA working. That was kind of the hub for television. But also, he's Canadian and he's from Toronto, where he ended up sourcing a lot of talent from for those early seasons. Was there, like, do you think New York is one of those critical pieces to make SNL what it is? And to, like, is there something about it, New York, that's special? Would SNL not work in those other places?
Yeah, I think that New York is crucial to the show. New York is almost a character in the show, in the same way that Lorne is a character in the show. And one of the interesting things I learned researching the book is, there were so many ways in which SNL almost didn't happen. One of the ways was that when the opportunity arose for him to come to New York and do this show that NBC wanted, that Herb Schlosser wanted out of 30 Rock, Lorne came very close to saying no. Because, as you say, he grew up in Canada where it was cold. He loved living in Los Angeles, and he loved the desert. He went to this place in Joshua Tree and ate mushrooms all the time. He loved the desert. He loved the beach. He loved the way Californians weren't pretentious about, he liked the way they prioritized fun. He said that the prospect of moving to New York in 1975, which is the municipal crisis that just happened, you had the famous Daily News headline, Ford to City Drop Dead. The city was about to go bankrupt. He thought the city was very pretentious. He said to me, in Los Angeles, you had the Eagles. In New York, you had the Ramones. In LA, you had people, Ken Kesey painting flowers on the side of a van. In New York, you had depressed people sitting in the basement reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He wasn't dying to come here. That said, once he arrived, he quickly took to it, and he loved the way. First of all, he loved the way New York was where live television originated back in the 1950s. He, as I said, he's kind of sentimental. He cares about the history of the medium. But he loves New York. He's a real New Yorker now. And I think that, I think New York and the show are such great metaphors for each other, because the one constant thing in New York is that it's always changing. It's always being torn up and rebuilt in the same way that SNL is always being torn up and rebuilt. Cast members leave, new ones come on. It's all about kind of constant regeneration. And I think he finds that exciting and glamorous.
With the element of kind of the constant regeneration, I was also thinking a lot about how it feels like with our, because you document 50 plus years realistically, because you have, Lorne's childhood and his life before SNL. but you document this major shift in entertainment and culture and everything. And I think one of the things that I was, following along with was the idea of, back in the early days of television, I mean, the viewers that were watching these programs on a weeknight, we can't even like there would be more viewers for a random episode of a comedy show on a Tuesday night than there are for like the Super Bowl now, right?
Right.
Like the viewership was just so totally different. But it feels like as things kind of with the internet and social media and things get and streaming, I think being a big part of it, network TV not being as important as it was or influential, the culture being more fractured than it's ever been. What about SNL? Because it feels like SNL is kind of almost like the last piece of monoculture that we have in America, aside from maybe like massive movies or things like that. It feels like it's really the only thing that we can all collectively hold on to when we're not staring at our own devices and streaming whatever we want. What about SNL? It makes it that monocultural moment.
Well, I think that for one thing, the fact that it's done live, for people who are aware of what
Hmm.
that means, there's nothing else like it that is done with no net that way. But I think that the other part of the longevity is that it is a format that works as, you can stream it. You can watch it on your phone the next day in little segments. It's hard to imagine like a 90-minute network show that wasn't a kind of a bunch of little segments having that kind of purchase just because it would be too hard to get everyone sitting at home at 11:30 to watch it. And in fact, when SNL was first being discussed in the NBC boardroom, there were a lot of the old research guys who said, "You're never going to get young people home at 11:30 to watch this. Or the only people who are going to watch this show are people who can't get laid." They were just saying no one's going to watch it. But I think that the fact that it's dovetailed so beautifully with the way people consume television now, which is they can watch it the next day. They can watch just the music, they can listen to the music in their car. They can that's just worked perfectly in Lorne's favor. But also, he has he built this very durable format that has lasted. It's durable. He often compares the show to a Snickers bar in terms of managing viewer expectations. He'll say, with a Snickers bar, people expect a certain amount of chocolate, a certain amount of peanuts, a certain amount of caramel. You give them that, they're going to basically feel satisfied. There are no surprises in a way. Of course, the cast members rotate in and out. You have musical guests. So there's always some spice and some newness, but there is also this comforting formula that everyone knows what they're going to get. And I think that's the secret.
He does have, I think that is maybe, we're talking about his superpowers or gifts before, but I think and I forget what the exact quote is that you have in the book about him having this kind of, magnetic connection to what is relevant and like he's really fighting for relevance all the time for the past 50 years. Like that's something that seems to be kind of like his North Star, is the idea that if you don't stay relevant,
Right.
you are going to be canceled or you're going to fade away or you're not going to be popular. And that was making me think about how, they do such a good job with the talent booking on the show of always having whoever that hot celebrity is or that actor who's having a breakout moment in a role
Yeah.
or a musical performance who, I mean, it is an interesting thing as you get older. Cause I mean, I was watching SNL, I started watching when I was in high school, and watching the musical acts go from the people that I was listening to now musical acts. I'm
Right.
like, I don't know who this person is. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's
Yeah.
because I'm aging out of who they're trying to appeal to. I'm like, great.
Right.
It's a fascinating thing. It's a very cool thing.
Well, in the beginning, I mean, with the music, people don't realize it, but it was, of course, before MTV and everything, but
Mhm.
rock bands that people took seriously, they wouldn't do TV. TV was seen as incredibly déclassé, and so when I was in college, like you would all go over to the one kind of rich kid's room who had a television, because people didn't
Mhm.
have televisions in college. And, if the Rolling Stones were on or the Talking Heads or something, you would all watch that band on television because bands just weren't on TV, and I think that he's always managed to find the thing. Since in the last 20 years, it's been politics. You know,
Mm.
after 9/11, I mean, the show has always done political satire, but it has become a much bigger thing in terms of setting the agenda for American political conversation. You know, during presidential election years, the debate sketches that the show has aired have been hugely influential. You know, Al Gore's handlers had him watch Daryl Hammond's impersonations of him on the show to try to teach him what not to do, you know. And we know that during the first Trump administration, Trump was more obsessed with SNL than he was with ISIS or the Middle East or anything else. You know, so politics, there's a reason why the cold open, which is the first segment of the show these days, is usually about politics, because everyone wants to see what the show is going to have to say about, you know, the latest Trump disaster.
Do you have a like what in your mind is like your like when you think about SNL prior to working on this book? Because now I'm sure you have many thoughts about it, but
Yeah.
what is your like when you think about the cast, like who are you picturing in your head from when you were watching it?
Well, Lorne likes to say, and I think he's true, that he's right, that everybody always thinks the best cast was the one that was on when they were in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to do with, it's like the way you remember the music on the AM radio when you were in high school. But so I was in high school during the first cast, and I love them. But there are two other casts that I'm especially fond of for different reasons. One is the cast in the late 80s was Phil Hartman, Jan Hooks, Dana Carvey. I just thought there was a great writing staff then too. That was an era of amazingly nimble performers who had great chemistry with each other. Church Lady, I mean, everything Phil Hartman did, I think was amazing. But I also love the cast from maybe 15 years ago. You know, the Bill Hader, Kristen Wiig, Fred Armisen cast. I thought they had a kind of a hipness, a kind of a coolness altogether that you don't often see in a cast. And they just seem to so enjoy each other. What's your favorite?
I think that cast is what I think about. Like I do, because once again, they were who I was watching when I was in high school. But Bill Hader and Andy Samberg and Kristen
Yeah.
Wiig and Jason Sudeikis, like I do think that that was a. It felt like a very. Once again, I'm biased. Like I can't see it aside
No,
from
I
that kind
think
of
you're right,
nostalgia,
though. I
but it did
wasn't a
seem like it was
teenager
something
then, and
different.
I would ratify that.
Basically, an impossible question for you, but do you have like if you had to pick like one sketch out of 50 years of SNL, would you be able to pick one or too impossible?
I'm going to pick two.
Okay.
One is a sketch called Master Brain, which was the idea of Robert Smigel, who's that you might know as Triumph the
Mhm.
Insult Comic Dog. And it was about Ronald Reagan, played by Phil Hartman. And the concept was that far from being the dolt that everybody thought Reagan was, he was actually this brilliant strategist. And you'd see him with his cabinet being totally sharp and brilliant. And then a Girl Scout would come in for a photo op and he would turn into this doddering old guy, you know. And another one is one written by my dear friend Jim Downey, who also stars in the sketch, and it's called The First Bank for Change. It's a parody of a bank commercial where Jim Downey plays this guy, you know, benignly just explaining that at this bank, you know, we'll give you change. If you give us a five, we'll give you 5 ones. We'll give you 26 quarters. Well, and it's what they call a room temperature sketch. It's very low key, but a brilliant, brilliant high concept.
That's awesome. I have had so much fun talking to you, and I'm sure we could spend many more hours talking about SNL and comedy and Lorne Michaels and everything. I am curious to hear. I know that you've been working on this book for a very long time.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas for what's next or what's coming up? Did you catch the biography bug, or do you think you're going to take a break
Well,
for a
I'll
while?
tell you, this is my first real book, and a biography is a really tough one to begin with because, you know, you're not only writing about Lorne Michaels and his huge cast of characters, but it had to be kind of a cultural history of the last 75 years. I mean, I love doing it, but no, I mean, for now, I have a pretty demanding day job as an editor at the New Yorker. And what I'm enjoying right now is just being able to do my job without this other deadline hovering over me. So that's what I'm doing for now. I have a couple ideas kicking around in my head, but I don't think I'm going to do anything as encyclopedic as this anytime soon.
Right. I don't know if you could. I feel like you might have just gotten the most difficult one out of the way, right? Because I can't think of anything else that would be this complex for your next one. But
I learned a lot.
yeah, definitely. We're just about out of time. Congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for writing it. I mean, like I said, as a comedy nerd and an SNL fan, like it's just been so much fun reading it and just getting this glimpse into not only history, but also the production of the show and into Lorne's life, which is obviously very candid and has been close guarded. So I'm sure he's not listening right now, but also thanks to Lorne for participating in
I owe him
helping
a
write
lot.
it.
He was extremely generous with his time, and that was a surprise. I mean, he doesn't do this, so I'm very grateful.
So if you've been listening to our conversation and you enjoy our conversation and you're a fan of SNL, fan of comedy, fan of biographies, this is a really great one. If you're looking for a great Father's Day gift, I know Father's Day is coming up. This would be a really great Father's Day gift. It's a good graduation present, even just like a summer read. I think people will really enjoy it. So head on over to Barnes & Noble, your local store, to get Lorne, the man who invented Saturday Night Live. Also, quick plug for the audiobook. I was checking out the audiobook, and you and the narrator did such a great job with the audiobook component of this as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really wanted to do the whole thing, but I was told that it would mean taking a month off of work. So I just didn't have time. I did the introduction and the last chapter, and it was fun. I really liked doing it.
It sounds great. So if you're listening and you like audiobooks, you prefer books in that form, definitely check that out because it's a good one. That's also available at bn.com and also on the Barnes & Noble Nook app. Susan, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with me. I really appreciate it. Best of luck with the book and with the future.
Thank you, Chris. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.